Donald Trump is back in office, and one of his first acts was to end what's called birthright citizenship. As a citizenship expert, I see a lot of misinformation in the U.S. media about exactly what this is. And today we're going to set the record straight, tell you what this means for folks who've been relying on it, and tell you what it means for Americans in general. Donald Trump said he would end birthright citizenship if he were reelected.
You promised to end birthright citizenship on day one. Is that still your plan?
Yeah, absolutely.
But the process is a bit less understood. Birthright citizenship in the United States was started in 1868 with the 14th Amendment, and they included the clause subject to the jurisdiction thereof, ostensibly to ensure that diplomats and invading armies wouldn't get citizenship for their children just because they happened to be in the United States. The understanding for some time has been pretty much everybody born in the U.S. is a U.S. citizen, and I have personal experience with this because when I renounced U.S. citizenship, I got what's called a certificate of loss of nationality. And on it, it says, Andrew Henderson obtained citizenship by virtue of birth in the United States. The fact that both of my parents were born in the United States, the fact that both of them are U.S. citizens is absolutely irrelevant. I was born in the United States, and that's what made me a U.S. citizen under the concept of what's called jus soli. Jus soli is a way that a lot of countries and the Americans look at granting citizenship, which we're going to talk about in a minute, versus European and most Asian countries, which focus on jus sanguinis, the idea of citizenship through the blood, versus the more American as a continent concept of citizenship on the soil. And that jus soli was upheld in a landmark Supreme Court case, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark in 1898. This was a child that was born to Asian immigrants and ultimately ruled, the guy can be a U.S. citizen. Another significant case was Perkins versus Elg in 1939, where the Supreme Court ruled that a person born in the U.S. to immigrant parents would retain their U.S. citizenship, even if they left after getting the citizenship and was raised abroad, provided they returned to the U.S. and assumed its duties upon reaching adulthood. That's not really something that is really an issue anymore. There are a handful of countries like Ireland, for example, that if you're naturalized, they ask you to continue to live there to maintain that citizenship. It can be kind of nebulous at times exactly what they want. But really, these days, a U.S. citizen is a U.S. citizen. There's no class of, you left when you were young, because plenty of people like me who were born to American parents, we could have moved overseas as well. That wouldn't have taken away my U.S. citizenship. And so I think people often misunderstand long absences from the U.S., that doesn't invalidate your citizenship. In fact, pretty much the only way to invalidate U.S. citizenship by birth is to do as I did and renounce it. And so even though Donald Trump has said that the United States is the only country that does this,
we're the only country that has it.
Through an executive action?
We're the only country that has it.
In fact, nearly 36 countries around the world do this. And quick side note, we made an episode on why I really don't hire Americans. In that clip, you see a news anchor with one of the biggest news organizations in the United States who's paid millions of dollars a year, who just nods to an absolutely false claim. I have people working for me for $2,000 a month who came in on day one knowing exactly how this system works and where it works. And that's one of the reasons we hire people all around the world, is because they seem to have a better handle on the stuff that we do with visas and citizenships and taxes and all that. So the policy in the United States, whether you agree with it or not, is largely in line with the policy of much of the Americas. Canada has the same policy, and Canada has some of the same birth tourism issues. You may have seen headlines over the years about places in Vancouver that they go out and they find Asian women have gone there to basically give birth and have Canadian citizen children. And I've long said, if you're going to pick between one of the two of them, why wouldn't you choose to give birth to a Canadian? Canadians still have special privileges more than any other country to live in the United States, and certainly to visit for longer than anybody else. Canada does not tax its citizens extraterritorially. You will not have to, as their parent, be filing a U.S. tax return for their lemonade stand income when they start to do that. And quite frankly, I never understood why anybody went to the United States other than the great marketing, when the same thing happens in Canada. But the same thing also happens in pretty much every other country in the region. Mexico has it. Most countries in Central America have it. And one of our speakers at Nomad Capitalist Live, Joshua Sheats, actually was in Costa Rica when one of his children was born. That child is now dual Costa Rican and U.S. citizen, merely by virtue of being born in Costa Rica. And if you are an affluent person, as Joshua is, quite frankly, I think having Costa Rican citizenship and freedom of movement in that region and a great, passport for traveling quite frankly, I think that's more advantageous if you already have some money and if you have some skills to be able to make money. You may not need the United States. And I think perhaps that's one thing where I feel like Donald Trump thinks the United States is the only place people can make money. I'm living proof that, yes, I made some money in the US, but most of my money has been made living overseas. And we can keep going south. I mean, pretty much every country in North, Central, and South America grants, you're born here, you're now a citizen status. Brazil, Argentina, Panama, they've all been discussed as places where Americans and other Westerners go to give birth because they want their children to have more neutral passports. Really, the only kind of exceptions are Colombia and Chile, where they require some sort of a permanent residence requirement of at least one of the parents when you're giving birth. And so those are two places where you couldn't give birth. But even the Caribbean, for example, we talk about citizenship by investment in some of the Eastern Caribbean countries. This is where you make a donation and in a year or a little less, you get a passport. You have freedom, you get a second passport. But you can go to St. Kitts and Nevis, for example, give birth, and your child will be a citizen of St. Kitts and Nevis for free. And so most countries in the Americas do this. There's a handful of other countries around the world, like Pakistan and Fiji, that also offer this unrestricted birthright citizenship. By the way, you might want to check where your parents were born, because we've literally had clients where their parents were born in Mexico, didn't even really realize they were Mexican citizens, and therefore their children could be Mexican citizens. And that could apply to theoretically any of these countries. So definitely check your family tree, especially your parents. Where were they born? And you might be entitled to a second passport for free. Now, the Chile and Colombia model that I mentioned is actually largely what I think Donald Trump wants, where he's saying at least one parent should be a permanent resident of the United States. Now, the challenge with that, as has been discussed by some experts, is there's plenty of people who are legally in the United States, i.e. student visa holders, or the much discussed H-1B program visa holders, where they're not permanent residents. They don't have a green card. There's other visa categories like O1, exceptional talent. We've had clients who have that. Those are not necessarily visas that require you to pay U.S. tax if you don't live there. E-2 visa holders, where you make an investment in the United States. You're not a permanent resident. And so for clients of ours who, let's say they have some kind of U.S. business and they're giving up their U.S. citizenship, or they never had U.S. citizenship, they want access to the U.S. as a resident permit holder, but if they don't live there full time, they don't want to pay U.S. taxes on their foreign interests, they might get an E2 or an O1. Or again, other people might be students. The Donald Trump model that would follow what only Chile and Colombia do would basically say, yeah, your kids aren't U.S. citizens. Now you can say, hey, that's fine. You have a passport somewhere else. Your child should be a citizen of those countries. But it's something to keep in mind, because I think people don't understand the difference between even residence and citizenship, let alone the different levels of residence. Permanent residence is something that you would generally work towards. There are things like the EB-5 program where you get an instant green card. And so people want a green card, but that comes with certain tax requirements, and not everybody living in the U.S. legally has a green card. The other thing is that it's been legal for people to come to the U.S. as tourists, whether on an ESTA, because they're Australians or German or whatever. I don't think too many people are doing that, but also on a tourist visa. I know someone who is Armenian, went to the U.S. Embassy in Armenia and said, hey, my husband and I, we want to visit the U.S. We're going to be there for a few months. And they did that as they were pregnant. And they went and they followed all the rules, and they gave birth in a U.S. hospital, and now they have a U.S. citizen child. I certainly would not have recommended that to them. I would have told them to go somewhere else. But they did it without me knowing. But they were pretty upfront about it at all steps along the way, as far as I know. And I've seen episodes of some of these border security shows where the CBP border guards will say, yeah, listen, if you can support yourself, if you can pay the hospital bill, that's the law. We're going to let you in. But we want to make sure you're not going to stiff the hospital. The issue isn't, are you allowed to come here and give birth and have an American child? The issue is we want to make sure that you're going to pay your bill. So Donald Trump's apparent standard is you should have permanent residence. Again, interesting question of should someone who's working long-term in the U.S. be exempted from that just because it's a different residence program category? You can certainly understand, perhaps, the idea that you shouldn't be able to just engage in birth tourism on a B1, B2 tourist visa. That wouldn't be uncommon. If you come to our live event, Nomad Capitalist Live in Kuala Lumpur, and you go to Prince Court Medical Center and you give birth, your child will not be Malaysian under any circumstances. They will be the citizen of where their parents are from. A lot of countries around the world are already doing what Donald Trump is talking about. For example, in Europe, The standard is citizenship of the blood. Where are your parents from? Big exception that we see is Portugal. If you get a golden visa or another residence permit in Portugal and you hold that residence permit for a year, you can give birth in Portugal and your child will be Portuguese even though you're not, because you have some kind of residence permit. And in addition to all the citizenships of this child's parents, because they were born in Portugal, of which neither their parents are Portuguese citizens but are Portuguese residents, they are also now a Portuguese citizen, and that child has 4 passports at birth using that system. That wouldn't work really in any other European country. And so what my argument has been for years is, if you want to give your child a head start, you should go somewhere else and you should give birth where it is legal and it is allowed to give that child a second passport. If you're European, giving birth in Germany is not going to give your kids any extra advantages. Go to Brazil, go to Mexico, go to Panama, go to a country where they allow this. And particularly if you already have a Western passport, you don't really need another Western passport. You don't really need a US passport. That's pretty dangerous from a tax perspective. Canadian passport, those countries do kind of frown on it. I don't think Brazil particularly cares. I almost think some of the other countries actually welcome it. They're happy to have you go to their good hospitals and pay for their services. And what do they care? They're happy to give out a passport. Donald Trump obviously does care. To me, this isn't offensive one way or the other, but I think it's important to understand the ramifications of what's happening. Donald Trump says he was opposed to illegal aliens. Obviously, the electorate supported him in saying, hey, yeah, let's not give them citizenship for being here illegally. That's now been extended, though, to people there legally as tourists and now legally on the wrong kind, quote unquote, of residence permits. Obviously, as someone who gave up his U.S. citizenship, this doesn't make any difference to me, but I think it's important to understand what are the values of the country and what countries you're going to be more like if you go down this path. Donald Trump's campaign pledge was a lot against illegal immigration and illegal aliens. And so people obviously agreed with that because he got reelected. And so what the Trump camp argues is that illegal aliens weren't resolved by those past Supreme Court cases because in those earlier cases, their parents were legally in the U.S. And yet that doesn't entirely square with saying that people who are on, let's say, a B1, B2 visa or an ESTA or who have other, the wrong kind of work permits, they perhaps will have their children not subject to this U.S. jurisdiction for purposes of birthright citizenship. Now, obviously, illegal immigration wasn't really much of a thing even 100 years ago. I mean, Ellis Island, anybody could just show up. And so the idea of even passports is very much a thing of basically the last century. And so the idea that a case in 1898 would have the same review of illegal immigration that it would today doesn't really make sense either. Here's the bottom line. Donald Trump wants, as of February of 2025, that unless you are the child of a citizen or a green card holder, you won't be a U.S. citizen. Now that obviously is in addition to anything else they're doing with removing illegal aliens, for example. It seems anyone born before that would be fine. I know that in the first Trump term there was talk of denaturalization, which a lot of administrations hadn't really done, but the idea was we're going to go through and see if when you were naturalized as a citizen, did you commit any kind of fraud? Did you answer anything inaccurately? One of the big stories around that was somebody who was in the Nazi regime. And then when they came to the U.S., they said, no, I've never been involved in anything like that. Well, that person lied to become a citizen and they can become denaturalized, and Trump stepped that up in the first term. I don't know that you can go back and say that someone's child who was born in the U.S. a year ago or 10 years ago is no longer a U.S. citizen. So my view is this is going to make the U.S. somewhat less competitive, at least at the margins. My business is helping successful people go where you're treated best. And that means to move to places that they feel comfortable overseas. There are more options than ever. We're seeing a lot of folks who might have wanted to move to the United States 25 or 30 years ago. They're now going to Dubai. They're now going to Qatar. They're now going to Singapore. They're now going to Ireland. They're going to other places that have made it really easy for them to move there and get a job or bring their business, whereas the U.S. legal immigration system is very much backlogged. And so if I'm a young couple and I'm coming from India, for example, why would I want to move to the United States and pay incredibly high taxes, deal with the filth in San Francisco if I work in the tech industry, for example, and then when I give birth there, not even get the benefit of having a U.S. citizen child, when instead I can go to sparkling clean, tax-free Dubai, and I can perhaps make a little bit lower salary, but keep more of it, be closer to my family, live in more comfort, have more people from my culture around. why would I go to the United States? I mean, the proposition is going to be less interesting. And perhaps there's people who say, yeah, good, we don't want that person coming. Okay, well, I mean, you're going to have less talent if you're going to end this. It doesn't bother me ending birthright citizenship. Again, I would tell anybody who's successful, please don't give birth in the United States. Give your child the chance of not ending up, for example, like Boris Johnson, the former Prime Minister of the UK. He was born in the US, he left at 5, and when he sold his flat in London, the IRS came knocking at his door for a tax bill that the country he lived in didn't even assess. The IRS is what taxed him. Why would you put your kids through that? Only people, in my mind, who are really coming from desperate situations would want to have a US child if they're not Americans themselves. But I think that from a US perspective, you're going to have less talent wanting to come. Here's the other issue, and it speaks to why ultimately I chose to renounce citizenship, is I just don't have a great fundamental trust in the US government and its institutions. I think that they're a lot more corrupt. I think it's just a lot worse place than the average person thinks it is, that the marketing tells you it is. And so the Supreme Court, being 6-3 on the conservative side, could help get this through, and ultimately that's where this could be decided. I mean, they voted 9-0 to basically suppress the First Amendment and just say TikTok has to go because we don't like them. So what's to say they wouldn't squash what some believe is the 14th Amendment? And so beyond that, the Vice President of the United States, who thinks that if you don't have kids, you shouldn't get to vote.
If you're not here permanently, if you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States and don't plan to be, why would we make those people's children American citizens permanently?
Makes this argument that you're not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, even though you're literally in the U.S. and subject to all the U.S. laws. I mean, it just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not an anti-Trump guy. I'm not a left-wing guy. This is Nomad Capitalist. I'm an extreme capitalist who helps people pay as little tax as legally possible. And yet it concerns me that this country, the great United States, really? I mean, if those parents who are on an H-1B visa committed a crime, would they be subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Well, of course they would. This idea that they're not when it comes to, giving their children citizenship as enshrined in the Constitution, fine, change it. By all means, change it. That process doesn't bother me. Sure, plenty of countries in the world don't give citizenship to tourists or illegal immigrants. No problem with that if that's what your country wants to do. But we should at least try and square the arguments that we're making. And so for me, I think that the U.S., at some margins, is probably going to lose some people who are going to look at this and say, it just doesn't really make sense. But it'll be interesting to see what happens, whether this gets resolved through an actual constitutional amendment, which would be really hard, or whether it just goes to the Supreme Court and they say, yeah, we agree with your interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Either way, I would plan on having a place, whether I'm American or not, where am I going to give birth to my children so where they have the most opportunities? And if that was the U.S., well, I mean, you probably should look at that.